fate of Europe seems ever more precarious, with the Dutch government teetering and the French election delivering a likely loss to Nicolas Sarkozy. The IMF has managed to rattle it in successfully for a $430 billion firewall. But it is another firewall. And will that satisfy markets? Well, I'm joined now from Singapore by Ken Courtis, global economist and co-founder of Themes Investment Management. Ken, good evening to you.
Thank you, Tiki. Nice to be here.
Well, where do we start? The IMF, I suppose. There's a fair amount of backslapping about this $430 billion. But what is the money for? It is another firewall. Is it helpful?
Well, it's helpful. They were looking for $1 trillion. They've got to 430. Some major countries haven't committed. They've said no. The United States has said no. Canada has said no. China hasn't really said if it's going to say yes or no yet. They're still negotiating. The real issue behind this firewall that they're trying to contain, of course, is this European crisis that looks like it's now headed to a new phase of even perhaps more complicated turmoil than we've had in recent months. My view, Tiki, is that $400 billion is a lot of money, but compared to the crisis that's coming in Europe, I still think they're going to have to come back and raise more money.
Christine Lagarde was trying to assure everybody that the money wasn't earmarked for Europe. But I think a lot of people feel that raising this money just adds support to the German line about austerity at the time when we've got people like Paul Krugman writing in the New York Times and saying that this is all economic suicide.
Well, Tiki, I think a lot of this money won't go directly to Europe, because if Europe gets into a new phase of crisis, as it was last fall, maybe even bigger, there will be a lot of people sideswiped. Smaller countries in Eastern Europe, countries that used to export to Europe and their exports are falling. As European banks cut back, a lot of emerging markets won't be able to get credit lines for trading. So that's where I think a good portion of this money is. It's going to go to try to handle the collateral damage of the European crisis. Fundamentally in Europe, we now have an increasing divide between the European German line, which is the code word is fiscal stabilization, which basically means austerity, cutting budgets, and what they call internal devaluation, which means forcing wages down to try to make the weaker countries more competitive. And the new line that's becoming stronger, I think, as a result of the French elections, which is an anti-austerity line, which is a don't cut the budget so fast, let's get some growth line. And I think the two now are headed for a real confrontation over the next few months.
In addition to France, of course, we've got the Dutch government near collapse now, with Geert Wilders saying he couldn't cave into dictators in Brussels on austerity. We've got France potentially much more anti-austerity with François Hollande, and we've now got this happening in Holland. What is going to happen in places like Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece?
Well, I think the French elections here are absolutely vital. Because what we've seen is 75% of the electorate voted against the government candidate. And that 75% of the electorate is pretty much entirely camped now on a position against austerity. And whatever form this government takes, whoever's leading it in Paris after the legislative elections in June and the second round of the presidential elections in May, this is going to be a government that is not going to take the same line of alliance with Germany that we've seen in the last many months. Now, on the German side, the Germans are looking at a very different scenario. They're looking at unemployment, which is at the lowest level since World War II. They're looking at a huge real estate boom. Their banks are into a credit bubble. And money is just like a tsunami coming into Germany, and it's just flooding the place. And the Bundesbank and the German authorities now are really getting afraid of inflation. So they want actually to cut and reduce, as the rest of Europe will want to expand and try to grow out of this. And you've got now an irresistible force running into an immovable object, and this is going to be a real mess.
Well, yes, as you say, when you look around the world, do you see any good news coming from any quarter?
Well, I'm pretty optimistic and upbeat on China. I think China's bottoming this quarter. We had better production numbers out today. I think the government is now loosening. Yes, there's big issues of leadership and this this complicated affair that's going on in China at the top of the government of who killed who and what and everything. But I think they'll get that straightened out. And I believe the Chinese economy will be the locomotive pulling the rest of the world as we move through the second half this year. So I put that up as the real positive force. And the second positive force, I think the U.S. is doing better. Yeah. It's not doing great, but it's doing a heck of a lot better than it was 12 months ago.
Ken Courtis, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Pleasure.